Welcome back. When we left off last time, the Duke of York was on his way back to London from Ireland with an army at his back, ostensibly to remove the Duke of Somerset from his sphere of influence around King Henry. And we talked last time about how this is probably just an excuse to march on the capital with an armed troop. York is using the commoners' mistrust and dislike of Somerset to test the limits of how much power he really commands. And like Bolingbroke decades earlier, once he gets the king to consent to one demand, he'll start making more, presumably, even to the extent of the crown itself. But we also need to explore why this would be such a good excuse, and why the commoners mistrusted Somerset in the first place. We know that they didn't like Suffolk, right? Because he had been the one who arranged for the king's marriage to Margaret, and because he was proud and haughty and drunk with power. But what did Somerset ever do to them? Well, Shakespeare doesn't get into this, but we know if we study the history of it, we get some rumors. And if we believe the rumors, and it's important to keep that in mind that they might be just that, we don't know. But if we believe the rumors, the Duke of Somerset at this time was involved in all kinds of corrupt mischief, not just politically, but morally as well. There was a possibility that he had an affair with Henry V's widow, Catherine of France, back in the 1420s. And that would have been about 20 years before the action of this play takes place. This would have been before she married Owen Tudor, which we've also talked about in past lectures. So there's that. Then it was also rumored that he had an affair with Margaret, and that the child that she eventually had, and we don't learn about this child until the next play, may have actually been Somerset's and not King Henry's. And this might account for Margaret's inexplicably taking Somerset's side during the debate that takes place in Act 5. Her old secret lover, Suffolk, is dead now, and so she's replaced him with a new one. But imagine what relationship this puts him in with Henry, his sovereign king. He's been having secret affairs with both his mother, Catherine, and his wife, Margaret. And of course, Henry either doesn't suspect anything or he's pretending that he doesn't know to keep the peace. But the commoners, who clearly see their king as needing protection from his corrupt counselors, they're hearing these rumors, and they aren't too happy with them, whether their rumors are true or not. Not to mention the fact that Somerset was the regent of France, which he then lost, which we've already seen as a point of sore grievance amongst them too. So there's this bias against Somerset that did exist, again, whether or not the rumors were true or just rumors. And then there's one other important historical detail that Shakespeare doesn't tell us about. But it's super critical to keep this in mind for understanding the context of the War of the Roses. And that's that at some point between France being lost, the end of the 100 Years' War, and the events that we're reading about in Act 5, King Henry suffered a complete mental breakdown. For about the space of a whole year, he was completely unresponsive to everything around him, including the birth of his son, Edward, who again may have been Somerset's and who we don't meet in this play yet, but who we do meet in the next play. Now, the exact cause as to why the breakdown occurred isn't certain, but it was more than likely genetic, and only incidentally triggered by external factors like the affairs of the state. Remember who Henry's grandfather was. Charles of France, the Mad King, who had intermittent periods of insanity all throughout his reign. That's why when we were reading Henry V, you'll remember that it seemed like his queen, Isabel, was keeping a close watch on her husband and doing some backseat ruling on his behalf. Well, Henry apparently inherited this mental disorder, and so if it seems like he's, completely helpless throughout the events of Act 4 and here in Act 5, and even on into the next play, this is probably why. And with Henry in such a dependent, sometimes almost catatonic state, a lot of policies and rules were being set by Margaret and by her new favorite, Somerset. Now we can speculate as to why Shakespeare chose not to talk about Henry's madness. He certainly wasn't adverse to using madness as a plot device. Look at King Lear and Hamlet. There are a lot of madmen in his plays. He seems to like that trope. But he didn't bring it up here. And maybe it was because he wanted his audience to be on the Lancaster side of the conflict. And having the leader of that faction be out of his mind would have dampened the favorable impression that he was trying to make. It's clear that Shakespeare is trying to make York out to be the usurper, and pretty clearly the villain in this story. But the trouble is that York does have a legitimate claim to the throne, as we've talked about before. And if you add onto that the fact that the current king is truly incompetent, then maybe it would be all too easy to start favoring the Yorkist faction if you're trying to be impartial judges. And I think that's probably the reason. Shakespeare wants his audience on the Lancaster side, and so he's painting them in a favorable light. But all this is to say that Somerset, since his return from France, has gained way too much power for people's comfort, and he wasn't meeting any resistance from the ruling monarch when he overstepped his bounds. So the Duke of York has every reason to suspect that the people will be on his side if he comes to London with the declared intention of doing away with Somerset. So as Act 5 begins, he's come up with his army to a town called St. Albans. And this is where Henry and the other nobles were hawking back in Act 2, where the fake miracle happened. It's a smaller rural city, but it's also one of the oldest ones in the country. In fact, even now, there's still a tavern there that claims to be the oldest pub in England. It was this small city, but it was also the destination of local pilgrimages to visit the shrine of St. Alban, which we've already heard about, which would have been located in the Benedictine Abbey that the town was centered around. By the way, you can read about St. Alban and what he did there in Bede's Ecclesiastical History of England, if you have that book. And now, with an army at his back, York is being much more open and honest about himself and his ambition. He even states to us, the audience, that his reasons for coming back are none other than for claiming the crown. He says this at the beginning of Act 5. From Ireland thus comes York to claim his right, and pluck the crown from feeble Henry's head. Ring bells aloud, burn bonfires clear and bright, to entertain great England's lawful king. Ah, holy majesty, who would not buy thee dear? Let them obey that knows not how to rule. This hand was made to handle naught but gold. I cannot give due action to my words, except a sword or scepter balance it. A scepter shall it have I a soul, on which I'll toss the fleur-de-lis of France. So, he's ready to do or die here. But then, the king's army marches up, and the envoys tell him that Henry has acquiesced to all of his demands and has imprisoned Somerset. And it's funny, because we can see that this throws York back for a minute. Now, all of a sudden, his justification for battle's gone. Henry's folded, given him everything that he wants. So how can he claim that he still needs this army behind him? So he grudgingly gives the command for his soldiers to be dismissed. They're probably all lounging about St. Albans, and there's evidence to believe that Henry's men were doing the same. Apparently, both armies were anticipating a peaceful outcome here. They thought that the negotiations were going to go well, and so they were all drinking in the various pubs and bars in the town. Either that or they were ambling about the streets. There was a moment when the fighting began when a lot of Henry's men were taken by surprise. The signal for battle sounded and they thought, what? We're really going to have to do some fighting here? So all of the soldiers were really looking forward to going home at this point. York and Henry seemed to be on the verge of making peace. But then, here comes Margaret over the hill with Somerset by her side. Somerset, who's supposed to be in prison. And although the play doesn't tell us this, they would have had a large force of fighting men behind them too. When York sees this, the plans are all back on. He pounces on the chance to declare himself the victim, to accuse Henry of lying to him, and in the heat of the moment, he says what his real intentions are, that he wants the crown, that Henry's unfit to rule. Now, Henry is surrounded by his loyal supporters, so this isn't the wisest move on York's part. Somerset immediately orders York to be arrested, and the nobles and captains standing nearby move to do so. And we've already met a lot of them. There's Buckingham and Clifford, who were both instrumental in putting down the Jack Cade rebellion earlier. And there's also Clifford's young son, also called Clifford, who's going to feature more prominently in the next play. And we'll see that he's something of a Hotspur type of character. So York's in trouble. All of these noblemen are coming to arrest him. But now, probably detecting that peace talks have gone wrong over at the parley site or at the tent, wherever they're meeting, his men run in to defend him. There's Warwick and his father, Salisbury, who declare their allegiances to him. And two of York's sons also come up and say that they'll fight for him. And this is the first time in the plays that we meet these two sons of the Duke of York, but they're both grown men at this point, and it's important to take note of them because they'll both be kings in the future, Edward and Richard. And in case there's any mistaking the future Richard III, characters immediately start in with calling him a foul, indigested lump, and a crooked traitor, all in reference to this hunchback that he has. He's misshapen. Now, the Duke of York's other two sons, he has 4 of them. The other 2 are George and Edmund. They aren't featured in this play at all, but they were probably present at the battle too, and we'll see them in the next play. So, heated words are exchanged on both sides. It's clear that there are people in both parties who believe that they're in the right and who believe that they're acting honorably. Salisbury and Old Clifford both appear to be these honorable men who are trying to serve who they think is the rightful king. But negotiations break down. So, what's known as the First Battle of St. Albans begins, and it's a short battle. It didn't last much longer than half an hour, historically. York led his men down one of the main streets of the town, and they were met by Clifford's forces, who effectively repelled them. However, York manages to kill Clifford personally during this clash, and thus earns the enmity and eternal hatred of his son, young Clifford. He arrives just after his father has been slain, and he makes a vow that from this moment on, his only aim in life, his only goal, is to get revenge against York. He says this: "Oh, let the vile world end, and the primest flames of the last day knit earth and heaven together. Now let the general trumpet blow his blast, particularities and petty sounds to cease. Wast thou ordained, dear father, to lose thy youth in peace, and to achieve the silver livery of advised age, and, in thy reverence and thy chair days, thus to die in ruffian battle? Even at this sight my heart is turned to stone, and while 'tis mine, it shall be stony. York not our old men spares, no more will I their babes. Tears virginal shall be to me even as the dew to fire, and beauty, that the tyrant oft reclaims, shall to my flaming wrath be oil and flax. Henceforth I will not have to do with pity. Meet I an infant of the house of York, into as many gobbets will I cut it as wild Medea young Absyrtus did. In cruelty will I seek out my fame. Come, thou new ruin of old Clifford's house, as did Aeneas old Anchises bear, so bear I thee upon my manly shoulders, but then Aeneas bare a living load, nothing so heavy as these woes of mine. So, when a character in Shakespeare's play starts talking like this, especially when they start making references back to Greek tragedies like the Medea, or like to the fall of Troy, that always depicted these bloody cycles of revenge and hatred, it's worth taking note. Vows like this usually aren't threads of the plot that are dropped by Shakespeare. In another section of the town, where Henry's men were apparently resting in the market square with their helmets off, completely unaware that fighting was breaking out, Warwick stormed in with his men and overwhelmed them, and they immediately just fled. They left the town. They caught them unprepared. So now that the fighting was turning against the Lancastrian faction, at one point Somerset fled for refuge to one of the inns that stood on the corner of one of the streets where the fighting was happening, and the inn that he fled to was the Castle Inn. In the play, he meets his fate at the hands of Richard, the Duke of York's son, though this was, I think, Shakespeare's invention. I don't think it's ever stated by the historians who killed Somerset specifically. But here we get a duel between him and Richard right beneath the sign of the inn, which probably had a crudely painted castle on it, and Richard strikes him down. And then Richard says this: "So, lie thou there, for underneath an alehouse's paltry sign, the castle in St. Albans, Somerset hath made the wizard famous in his death. Sword, hold thy temper, heart, be wrathful still. Priests pray for enemies, but princes kill." So, Richard recognizes the significance of the setting, because he's heard what the conjurer's prophecy had to say, that Somerset should shun castles, because he would meet his end by a castle. It's a little bit better than the Duke of Suffolk's prophecy, right? Makes a little more sense than water and Walter. Now, though, both Suffolk and Somerset have met their ends in ways that are, they're both true and untrue to the meaning of the prophecy's words. Classic Shakespeare stuff here. The Lancastrian forces are overrun, and in the play, they retreat for London. Now, in real life, so again, a bit of a discrepancy here between what Shakespeare's showing us and what really happened, the Duke of York actually captured King Henry and brought him back to London as his prisoner. But I guess that Shakespeare decided a retreat would be more dramatic. There's a really strange moment where Henry doesn't seem to want to leave, but he's also not being very useful on the battlefield either. He seems completely lost, completely out of his element, and Margaret and young Clifford have to practically drag him away. And again, this might be a slight nod to his incapacitated mental condition at the time, which I talked about earlier. He can't make decisions for himself at this point. He has to be led around like a child or like a rag doll. So this is a complete victory for the Duke of York. He, his sons, and the Nevilles, they meet on the field of battle, and they agree to take off in pursuit of Henry before he can reach London and to call a session of Parliament. While this was a minor battle, only about 60 people were actually killed overall. It does mark the official start of the War of the Roses, so it's an important turning point. And it also elevates Warwick as an able military commander due to this surprise attack that he made in the market square of St. Albans. Next week, we'll be moving on to part 3 of the Henry VI plays. And for then, I'd like you to read Act 1. Thanks for watching.